Let me tell you about a woman named Sandra. Sandra is 53 years old. She lives in Cleveland, Ohio. She worked as a school cafeteria worker for 22 years. Not a glamorous job, not a high-paying job, but honest work, steady work. Work she showed up for every single day for 2 decades. In 2004, Sandra bought a house, a small house, 3 bedrooms, a little backyard, a neighborhood she knew. Nothing fancy, nothing extravagant, just a house. The thing that Americans have been told their entire lives is the foundation of a good life. The thing you work toward. The thing that means you made it. She put $5,000 down. Everything she had saved. The mortgage broker told her she qualified. Told her the payments were manageable. Told her this was a great investment. Told her home values only go up. He didn't tell her the loan had an adjustable rate that would reset in 3 years. He didn't tell her the reset would nearly double her monthly payment. He didn't tell her that the mortgage he was selling her had already been bundled with thousands of other mortgages just like it, packaged into a financial product and sold to investors around the world, and that the entire structure was built on the assumption that people like Sandra would eventually default. He didn't tell her any of that because he was paid a commission to close the loan, not to explain it, not to protect her, just to close it. And close it, he did. And then he moved on to the next Sandra, and the next, and the next. In 2007, Sandra's interest rate reset. Her payment went from $780 per month to $1,340 per month. She couldn't make it. She tried. She took a second job. She stopped eating out. She stopped everything. It wasn't enough. In 2008, Sandra lost her house. She didn't understand what had happened. She blamed herself for years. She thought she had been foolish, naive, not smart enough to understand what she was signing. But here is the truth. The truth that nobody told Sandra. The truth that took years and congressional investigations and court proceedings to fully establish. Sandra wasn't foolish. Sandra was robbed, deliberately, systematically, by some of the most powerful financial institutions in the history of the world, by men in suits in glass towers who knew exactly what they were doing and did it anyway, because the money was extraordinary, and the consequences for them were essentially zero. Sandra lost her house, lost her savings, lost years of her life. The men who robbed her got bonuses, and not one of them went to prison. Not one. Okay, let me back up. Let me explain what actually happened. The complexity was part of the crime, and I want to make sure you understand it clearly, because understanding it is the first step to being angry enough to demand it never happens again. Let's start at the beginning. It's the late 1990s. The American housing market is doing well. Home prices are rising. Home ownership rates are climbing. The economy is humming. And on Wall Street, investment banks are looking for new products to sell, new ways to make money, new financial instruments that can generate the kind of returns their clients demand. Someone has an idea. Mortgages. Home mortgages. The loans that ordinary Americans take out to buy houses. Historically, boring. Safe. A local bank makes a mortgage loan. The homeowner makes payments for 30 years. The bank collects interest. Slow, steady, unglamorous. But what if you could take thousands of mortgages, bundle them together, slice them into pieces, and sell those pieces to investors around the world? The idea is called mortgage securitization. It already exists in a modest form. But now, in the late 1990s and early 2000s, it is about to explode into something that will eventually destroy the global economy. Here is why securitization became dangerous. When a local bank made a mortgage loan in 1970, that bank kept the loan. They held it on their books. If the borrower defaulted, the bank lost money, so the bank had every reason to make sure the borrower could actually repay the loan. They checked income. They checked credit. They required a substantial down payment. They were careful, because the risk was theirs. When securitization took over, that relationship broke. The bank making the loan no longer kept the loan. They sold it, immediately, to Wall Street, who bundled it with thousands of other loans, who sliced it into pieces, who sold those pieces to investors everywhere. The bank making the loan, and no longer cared whether the borrower could repay. They got paid when they closed the loan. Whether it defaulted 6 months later, not their problem. It had already been sold, already been bundled, already been sliced and sold again to a pension fund in Norway, or an insurance company in Germany, or a school district in Ohio. The incentive to be careful, and without that incentive, careful, went with it. Now, enter the mortgage brokers. These were the people who actually talked to Sandra, who sat across the kitchen table from her and explained the loan, and took her application and collected their commission. In the old model, mortgage brokers worked for banks. They were employees. They had salaries. They had reputations to protect. They had relationships with their communities. In the new model, mortgage brokers were often independent, paid purely by commission. Each loan closed was money in their pocket. Each loan denied was money not in their pocket. And Wall Street was hungry. Hungry for more mortgages to bundle. More mortgages meant more products to sell. More products meant more fees. More fees meant more bonuses. So Wall Street sent a message to the mortgage brokers: bring us more loans. We'll buy everything you can find. And the mortgage brokers brought more loans, by any means necessary. They lowered the standards. Then, they eliminated the standards. Then they invented products specifically designed to get loans to people who couldn't afford them, who would default. But not right away. Not for a year or two, long enough to be bundled and sold and for the money to be made. Ninja loans. No income, no job, no assets. They actually called them that. Loans given to people with no income, no job, and no assets. And these loans were approved, and bundled, and sold to investors as safe, liar loans, where the borrower's income was, let's say, creatively estimated, where the mortgage broker would ask, what do you make? And the answer was, whatever number makes this loan work. Nobody verified, nobody checked. Just write down whatever it takes. Teaser rates. Adjustable rate mortgages with artificially low initial payments that reset after 2 or 3 years to payments the borrower could never afford. Designed to look affordable and then become impossible. All of it legal, technically. All of it known, clearly known by everyone in the chain. The mortgage broker knew. The bank buying the loan knew. The Wall Street firm bundling it knew. The ratings agencies rating the bundles knew, or should have known, and chose not to look closely, because the money was extraordinary. Let me tell you about the ratings agencies, because this part is especially infuriating. When Wall Street bundled these mortgages into financial products, they needed ratings. Credit ratings. AAA ratings. The highest possible. The rating that says this is as safe as a US government bond. This is the safest investment possible. The ratings agencies, Moody's, Standard & Poor's, Fitch, they gave these products AAA ratings. They gave bundles of ninja loans and liar loans and teaser rate mortgages the same rating as US government bonds. Why? Because Wall Street paid them. The ratings agencies were paid by the very firms whose products they were rating. And if they didn't give the ratings Wall Street wanted, Wall Street would take its business to a different ratings agency. Wall Street, so the ratings agencies gave the ratings. AAA, safe as houses, pardon the expression, and pension funds, and insurance companies, and school districts, and municipalities around the world. All of them looking at that AAA rating. All of them thinking, this is safe. Buying these products, putting the retirement savings of ordinary people into bundles of loans that were designed to fail, this was not an accident. This was not a failure of understanding. This was fraud. The knowing misrepresentation of the risk of these products to investors who trusted the ratings. Fraud. And then there were the credit default swaps. This is where things get really dark. Really deliberately, consciously, knowingly dark. A credit default swap is essentially insurance. You can buy a credit default swap on a bundle of mortgages. If the mortgages default, the credit default swap pays out. It's insurance against the mortgages going bad. Now, here is the thing about insurance. Normally, you can only insure something you actually own. You can't take out fire insurance on your neighbor's house, because then you'd have an incentive to burn it down. But credit default swaps had no such restriction. You could buy a credit default swap on a bundle of mortgages you didn't own. You could bet that someone else's investment would fail. You could take out insurance on your neighbor's house. And then, if you were Goldman Sachs or Deutsche Bank or various hedge funds who understood exactly what was in these bundles, you could bet against them. Massively. While simultaneously selling them to your own clients as safe investments. Some of the biggest banks in America were doing exactly this, selling mortgage products to their clients. Telling those clients these were safe investments, and simultaneously buying credit default swaps that would pay off when those products failed. They were selling their clients a house they knew was going to burn down, while quietly buying the fire insurance themselves. And when the house burned down, and it burned down spectacularly, they collected, while their clients lost everything. That is not a market failure. That is not regulatory oversight. That is not an unfortunate consequence of complex financial instruments. That is fraud. Okay. So, 2006, 2007. The cracks start showing. Home prices, which had been rising for years, start to flatten, then dip, then fall. The teaser rate mortgages start resetting. Sandra's payment goes from $780 to $1,340. Millions of Sandras around the country face the same thing simultaneously. They can't pay. Default rates start rising. The bundles of mortgages start losing value. The AAA-rated products start looking less like government bonds and more like bundles of loans given to people with no income, no job, and no assets. Because that is what they are. The investors who bought these products start to panic. And then, September 2008, Lehman Brothers collapses. One of the oldest, most prestigious investment banks in America. 158 years old. Gone. Overnight. And the entire global financial system freezes. Literally freezes. Banks stop lending to each other because nobody knows which other bank is sitting on a pile of worthless mortgage products. The credit markets seize. The stock market crashes. Retirement accounts lose 30, 40, 50% of their value overnight. The Great Recession begins. Now, let me tell you what the Great Recession actually meant for real people. Not economic statistics. Real human beings. 10 million Americans lost their homes to foreclosure. 10 million. More than the entire population of New York City. 8.7 million Americans lost their jobs. Not temporarily. Lost them. And many never found equivalent work again. Older workers especially. The man who was a 55-year-old middle manager in 2008 who lost his job, he never really recovered. He worked part-time jobs and contract work and whatever he could find for the rest of his working life. His retirement savings decimated. His career over. $13 trillion in household wealth destroyed. $13 trillion. Gone from the savings and home equity and retirement accounts of ordinary Americans. $13 trillion. And it didn't distribute evenly. It never does. The people who had the least lost the most, proportionally. Working-class families who had bought homes, often the first in their families to own property, using the exact loans the banks had designed and marketed specifically to people like them. They were wiped out, completely, back to zero, sometimes below zero. The banks that caused all of this. They got bailouts. $700 billion in taxpayer money. The Troubled Asset Relief Program. TARP. The government looked at the banks that had committed fraud on a global scale and decided, we have to save them. They are too big to fail, too big to fail. And so the taxpayers who had been robbed bailed out the robbers. With interest. And now, here is the part that should make you the angriest. The part that is completely indefensible. The part that reveals everything about who this system is actually designed to serve. The prosecutions. After the savings and loan crisis of the 1980s, a similar but much smaller financial fraud. More than 1,000 bankers went to prison. More than 1,000. The Department of Justice investigated, prosecuted, convicted. People went to jail. After 2008, the biggest financial fraud in human history, not one senior Wall Street executive went to prison. Not one. Not one. The Department of Justice investigated. Sort of. They sent letters. They asked for documents. They held meetings. And then they reached settlements. Financial settlements. The banks paid fines. Large ones. Goldman Sachs paid $5 billion. JP Morgan paid $13 billion. Bank of America paid $16.65 billion. Numbers that sound enormous. Until you realize those fines were a fraction of the profits the banks made during the fraud. JP Morgan's $13 billion settlement represented roughly 1 year of earnings. 1 year. For crimes committed over a decade. And critically, crucially, unforgivably, no admission of wrongdoing. The banks paid the fines and did not admit they had done anything wrong. You can pay $13 billion and say we didn't do anything wrong. And the Department of Justice accepted that. Signed off on it. Let them say it. And the executives. The people who made the decisions, who designed the products, who approved the strategy, who knew what was happening and did it anyway. They kept their bonuses. Their bonuses that were paid with money from the very schemes that destroyed millions of lives. They kept them. Courts ruled they were contractually obligated. Their contract said they were owed bonuses regardless of the consequences of their decisions, and they kept their freedom. Not one senior executive at Lehman Brothers, at Goldman Sachs, at JP Morgan, at Countrywide, at Washington Mutual, at AIG, went to prison. Not one. Why? That is the question that haunts this story. That is the question that reasonable people have been asking since 2009 and have never received a satisfactory answer. Why did nobody go to prison? Some argue it was genuinely difficult to prove criminal intent. That fraud requires proving someone knew they were committing fraud. That the complexity of the financial instruments made it hard to establish what people knew and when they knew it. This argument is partially true. These were complex instruments. Proving criminal intent is genuinely difficult. But here is the thing. We have emails, thousands of them. Emails from bank executives describing the mortgage products they were selling as, and I'm paraphrasing because I want to be accurate, terrible, worthless, garbage. One Goldman Sachs email described a product they were selling to clients as a very ugly business. Another called the products dogs. Another joked about the people who were buying them. They knew. They wrote down that they knew. In emails that were later discovered in litigation. And still, nobody went to prison. Other people argue that the Justice Department was simply outmatched, that the banks had armies of lawyers, that the cases were impossibly complex, that the government lacked the resources and expertise to successfully prosecute. This is more credible. The banks spent hundreds of millions on legal defense. They could bury investigators in documents, delay proceedings for years, make the path to prosecution so difficult and uncertain that the Justice Department chose the easier path. The settlement, the fine, the non-admission. But here is the problem with that argument. The government chose to make it easier on themselves. They chose the settlement over the prosecution. They could have chosen differently. They had the emails. They had the documents. They had the evidence. They chose not to use it to put people in prison. Some people argue something darker, that the relationship between the government and Wall Street was too close, that the same people move between the Treasury Department and the big banks, that the Attorney General's office hires from and sends people to the same law firms that defend the banks, that the entire system is too interconnected for genuine accountability to happen. This argument is not a conspiracy theory. It is documented. The revolving door between Wall Street and Washington is real and well established. Whether it directly caused the failure to prosecute is harder to prove. But the perception of it, the appearance of it, is corrosive to public trust regardless. And whatever the reason, whatever the explanation, whatever the defense of the decision not to prosecute, the result is the same. 10 million families lost their homes. Not one banker went to prison. And the message that sends to every person in that system is clear, unmistakable, permanent. You can do this. And nothing will happen to you, as long as you do it in a glass tower in a suit. Let me tell you what happened to the banks after the bailout. They survived, obviously. That was the point of the bailout. And within a few years, they were thriving. Bigger than before. More concentrated than before. The crisis actually accelerated the consolidation of the banking industry. Smaller banks failed. The big banks absorbed them, got bigger. JP Morgan Chase is larger today than it was in 2008. Goldman Sachs is larger. Bank of America is larger. The too big to fail banks of 2008 are bigger now. More systemically important. More too big to fail than ever. And the bonuses came back. By 2010, Wall Street bonuses had recovered to near pre-crisis levels. The people who had caused the crisis were being paid record compensation again. Meanwhile, Sandra in Cleveland still doesn't own a home. The credit hit from the foreclosure lasted 7 years on her record. She rents now. She is 53 and she rents. The equity she had built, gone. The down payment she had saved for years, gone. The years of building towards something, gone. She is not unusual. She is 10 million people. And here is the thing about this story that we don't talk about enough. It wasn't random. It wasn't spread evenly across America. The predatory mortgage products, the ninja loans, the teaser rates, the liar loans, they were marketed specifically, deliberately, to specific communities, Black communities, Latino communities, working class communities, communities with less financial education, communities with less access to traditional banking, communities that had historically been excluded from homeownership and were finally getting their chance. The banks went to these communities specifically. Not because they thought these borrowers were the best credit risks. They knew they weren't. They went there because they knew these borrowers were less likely to understand the terms, less likely to have lawyers review the contracts, less likely to have family members with financial expertise who could warn them, less likely to fight back. Predatory lending was racially targeted. This has been documented, proven in court in multiple cases. Banks were fined specifically for targeting minority communities with their worst loan products. This wasn't just financial fraud. This was financial fraud with a specifically racialized targeting strategy. A strategy that used the aspiration of home ownership that had been denied to Black and Latino Americans for generations as the mechanism of their exploitation. That is not a small thing. That is not a footnote. That is a central part of this story that deserves to be named clearly. Now, 10 years later, 2018, Congress passed a law rolling back some of the financial regulations that had been put in place after 2008. The regulations designed to prevent it from happening again. The ones that required banks to keep more capital on hand, to be more careful about the risks they took, rolled back. The banks lobbied for it. They spent hundreds of millions on lobbying. They argued the regulations were too burdensome, too restrictive, too costly, that they were hurting lending, hurting growth. And Congress listened. And the cycle begins again. Not exactly the same way. The specific mortgage products that caused 2008 are less prevalent now. But the fundamental dynamic, the incentive to take risks that will be borne by others, the revolving door between regulators and the regulated, the too big to fail guarantee that socializes losses while privatizing profits, those are all still there. And somewhere, right now, in some glass tower, in some glass tower, some very smart people in very expensive suits are designing the next financial instrument that will generate extraordinary profits for a few years and then implode and destroy the savings and homes and retirements of millions of ordinary people who never fully understood what was being done to them. And when it implodes, when the crisis comes, the government will step in with taxpayer money. The executives will negotiate fines. There will be no admission of wrongdoing, no prison sentences. And the system will lurch forward to do it again, unless we demand something different. So what do we actually do? Because anger without action is just pain. And I don't want to leave you with just pain. Demand prosecutions. When financial fraud is committed, it should be prosecuted as aggressively as any other crime. The argument that financial fraud is too complex to prosecute is an argument for giving up on accountability for the powerful. We should reject it loudly and publicly. End the revolving door. The movement of people between regulatory agencies and the institutions they regulate creates conflicts of interest that undermine genuine oversight. Stronger restrictions on this movement, longer cooling off periods, more transparency about who is moving where. These are achievable reforms. Break up the too big to fail banks. If a bank is too big to fail without destroying the global economy, it is too big to exist. Teddy Roosevelt broke up Standard Oil. We can break up banks that have become systemically dangerous. This is not radical. It is basic, prudent financial regulation. Strengthen consumer financial protection. The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau was created after 2008 specifically to prevent predatory lending. It has been systematically weakened since its creation. Strengthening it, giving it more resources and more authority, would help protect the next Sandra. Vote. This is the most direct lever ordinary people have. The people who made these decisions got their power from politicians who let them have it. Those politicians serve at the pleasure of voters. This is a solvable problem at the ballot box if enough people are paying attention and angry enough to show up. And remember, tell this story, tell Sandra's story. Tell it to people who think this is ancient history or too complicated to understand. Because the complexity is not accidental. The complexity is designed to make you feel like you can't understand it. Like it's beyond you. Like you should just trust the experts. Don't trust the experts. Understand it yourself. Demand accountability yourself. Refuse to be bored into silence by the complexity. Because that silence, your silence, and mine, is what they're counting on. But Ganpa Zuria Salan Ella, in 2008, the most powerful financial institutions in the world robbed 10 million American families of their homes. $13 trillion of ordinary people's wealth, the retirement savings of a generation. The down payments people had saved for years. The equity families had spent decades building. Gone. And then, the government used taxpayer money to bail out the banks that did it. And then nobody went to prison. And then the banks got bigger. And then, the bonuses came back. And Sandra still rents. That is what happened. That is the complete, unvarnished truth of what happened. And we need to say it clearly. The American dream was stolen. In broad daylight, by people who knew exactly what they were doing, who wrote emails joking about what they were doing, and who faced no meaningful consequence for doing it. That is not acceptable. It was not acceptable in 2008. It is not acceptable now. And it will not be acceptable the next time it happens. Unless we make it unacceptable. Loudly, persistently, unforgivingly, the dream can be rebuilt. It has been before. But not by pretending this didn't happen. Not by accepting that this is just how things are. Not by letting the complexity and the passage of time quietly bury what was done, by remembering, by demanding, by refusing to let them off the hook, by making sure that next time somebody goes to jail. Thanks for watching. If this one made you angry, good. Share it. Someone needs to hear this today. See you in the next one.